Imagine, uh, imagine trying to play a 2-hour rehearsal with a 20-inch solid wood instrument.
Right, which is practically the size of a cello.
Yeah, practically a small cello, but pinned horizontally against your chest. I mean, think about the sheer torque on your left shoulder.
Oh, it would be agonizing.
Literally. Think about the fact that your elbow is digging into your ribs just to keep the scroll from, crashing into the floor.
Yeah, that sounds like an absolute biomechanical nightmare.
It really does. But if that sounds like a nightmare to you, well, welcome to 17th century Germany.
It was a very different world for string players back then.
It really was. So today we are diving deep. And a very special welcome to those of you joining us from the Viola Studio community.
Yes, welcome.
Whether you are a student right now battling your way through mastering the alto clef, or a teacher trying to pass down pedagogical traditions without ruining your student's posture.
Which is a real challenge.
Or even a seasoned performer heading into your next orchestra service. This deep dive is completely custom-tailored for you.
Because, we all know the modern stereotype.
Right. Oh, the viola is the middle child.
Exactly. The viola is so often treated as the middle child of the string family today. It gets the brunt of the jokes.
Always the jokes.
Right, and it just sits there nestled between the flashy violins and the sonorous cellos.
Yeah, historically it often has to, fight tooth and nail for its moment in the soloistic sun.
But today, we're looking at a specific time and place where that narrative completely flips.
Right on its head.
Yeah. A time when the viola was actually the absolute center of musical innovation, prestige, and honestly, wild experimental engineering.
Which is so cool. And we are so deeply accustomed to the violin taking the historical spotlight, as the virtuosic darling of the strings.
The nimble, high-flying soloist.
Exactly. But if we rewind the clock to this specific geographical location and era, the entire hierarchy of the string section is inverted.
It really is. The lower, darker, richer inner voices, they become the absolute obsession of the greatest musical minds of the day.
And that is exactly our mission for today. We are unpacking Maurice W. Riley's landmark work, The History of the Viola, Volume 1.
Specifically zeroing in on Chapter 5.
Yes, Chapter 5 with laser focus. We are traveling back to 17th century Germany, which is the era and the landscape that really laid the foundation for the viola's golden age.
And we aren't going to just skim the surface here.
No, we are getting into the weeds. We're going to look closely at the exact physical dimensions, like in centimeters and inches.
We'll break down the specific tuning systems, which frankly would completely baffle a modern player today.
Oh, absolutely. Plus the instructional treatises that teachers relied on, and the actual physical repertoire that shaped the very instrument you hold under your chin today.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
there's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
But getting into that mindset really requires us to shed our modern assumptions.
Yeah, because today, if you walk into a luthier shop anywhere in the world, the string family is highly standardized.
Right. A violin is essentially a violin. A cello is a cello.
But 17th century Germany was like an acoustic Wild West.
That's a great way to put it. It was a period of intense, almost chaotic, physical and musical experimentation.
I think the best way to conceptualize 17th century Germany is to look at it as a kind of historical Silicon Valley for string instruments.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, because you didn't have one unified, massive country with a centralized government dictating taste.
No, not at all. You had a fractured landscape of affluent, independent courts and duchies.
And these courts were fiercely cutthroat competitive with one another.
But they weren't just competing militarily or economically.
Right, just like tech companies today hoard the best software engineers to build proprietary code.
These German dukes hoarded virtuoso musicians to build proprietary soundscapes.
It's wild to think about. You couldn't just download a piece of music or stream a symphony.
Exactly. If your court had the most cutting-edge ensemble, with the richest, most complex, dark, multi-layered sound, you were flexing your political muscle.
Yeah, if someone wanted to hear that massive wall of sound, they had to physically travel to your court to experience it.
The acoustics of your chapel were literally a display of your geopolitical power.
Wow.
And these affluent courts, they could afford the luxury of supporting private, full-time groups of professional musicians.
So the dukes and patrons wanted a sonic signature that literally no one else in Europe possessed.
Exactly. But to understand the incredibly dense, rich music they were creating, we first have to understand the physical technology they were working with.
The hardware. To lean back into the Silicon Valley metaphor.
Right, the hardware. And this is where it gets completely mind-bending.
So to understand this hardware, we have to look at one of the most prolific, analytical, and frankly genius musical minds of the era.
We're talking about Michael Praetorius.
Yes, Michael Praetorius.
He is such a foundational figure in Western music history. He lived from 1571 to 1621.
And he was a highly respected German organist, a wildly inventive composer, and a very meticulous writer.
Just to give you an idea of his sheer output, he produced over 1,000 sacred and secular works during his lifetime.
I mean, let's just pause on that number for a second. 1,000 works.
It's staggering.
In an era before electricity, before Finale or Sibelius software, before easily accessible printing presses.
We are talking about the sheer physical volume of ink on parchment. The man must have barely slept.
Seriously. His work ethic was legendary. He became the director of music at the chapel of the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Right. And he also served at the Duke's court in Groningen. So he was deeply embedded in the upper echelons of this competitive court system.
He really was. But for our purposes, and really for any performer or teacher studying the deep history of stringed instruments, his most significant contribution isn't actually a piece of music.
No, it's a massive multi-volume treatise he compiled and wrote between 1618 and 1620.
Right, called Syntagma Musicum.
Syntagma Musicum is essentially the Rosetta Stone for early 17th century musical thought.
It really is the ultimate encyclopedia of how they thought about, built, and played instruments right on the eve of the 30 Years' War.
And specifically, we are diving into the section of that treatise entitled De Organographia,
which is completely devoted to documenting the tunings, the physical ranges, the exact dimensions, and the subjective tone qualities of all the musical instruments used in the early 17th century.
He even went so far as to include an appendix of 42 incredibly detailed woodcuts depicting these instruments to scale.
Which is an absolute treasure trove for modern musicologists and historical performance specialists.
Because it removes a lot of the guesswork, right?
Exactly. So Praetorius sits down at his desk in 1618, and he decides to methodically map out the entire string family of his day.
And in Syntagma Musicum, there's this specific legendary chart known as Table 22.
Table 22 is where the magic happens. In this table, he names and provides the exact open string tunings for all the members of what they call the Viola da Braccio.
Or the Geigen family. Now, for the Viola Studio listeners out there, you probably know that da Braccio literally translates to of the arm.
Right, and this was the crucial terminology used to distinguish these instruments from the da gamba instruments, the leg viols.
The ones played resting on the lap or between the knees.
Yes, the terminology is vital here. And when we actually look at Table 22, the sheer variety of instruments meant to be played on the arm is staggering compared to our modern standardized quartet.
Yeah, we're used to 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. But Praetorius doesn't list 4 instruments.
No, he lists 7 distinct members of this arm-held family.
It's crazy. Looking at Praetorius's table, it honestly feels like he's documenting an evolutionary dead end with the first few entries.
Let's break down the top of his list.
Okay, so the first 3 instruments he catalogs: the Kleinpausche Geigen, another slightly lower Kleinpausche Geigen, and the Discant Geige.
Right. And these were incredibly high-tuned instruments.
They are completely extinct today. Nobody plays them.
They didn't survive the evolutionary bottleneck of musical taste, unfortunately.
Because they were pitched an octave, or a perfect fourth, higher than our standard modern violin. All right.
Exactly. They were specifically designed to cut right through a dense, loud ensemble with a very bright, almost screaming, piercing acoustic profile.
So they lacked warmth, but they had incredible projection.
Then we get to number 4 on table 22, which is the recta discangage.
And he lists the tuning for this as G, D, A, E.
So finally, some familiar territory. This is our modern, present-day violin.
It survived the test of time intact. But as you move down the chart to numbers 5 and 6, this is where we hit the exact DNA of the 17th century viola.
And this is where the modern brain starts to glitch.
Totally.
Because this is where the acoustic landscape gets incredibly rich. Number 5 on Praetorius' list is an instrument he calls the tenor geige.
And he lists its tuning exactly as C, G, D, A.
Right, so that is exactly the modern viola tuning. The thick C string on the bottom, stepping up in perfect fifths to the A string.
Praetorius explicitly refers to this instrument in his notes as a small viola.
But then, and here is the kicker, he introduces number 6, which he calls the Bassa da Braccio.
And here is where the physics of the era start to look completely alien to us.
Because this specific instrument actually had 2 possible distinct tunings.
Right. The low tuning is C, G, D, A. That's an octave below the tenor geige.
Wait, C, G, D, A, that's the exact tuning of a modern cello.
Yeah, so they are tuning an arm-held instrument to the register of a modern cello.
The low tuning does correspond to our modern cello register, yes. But it's the high tuning of this Bassa da Braccio that is the true historical anomaly.
Oh, absolutely. This tuning is the absolute beating heart of the 17th century German viola sound.
The high tuning for this instrument was F, C, G, D.
Okay, let's translate those letters into physical, experiential audio cues for a second. F, C, G, D.
It's hard to even imagine.
Imagine taking your lowest string on a modern viola, that deep rumbling C string that gives the instrument its characteristic dark chocolate tone, and forcing it down a full perfect fifth to a low F.
Wow.
The kind of F that physically rattles your sternum when you drag a heavy gut string across it with a bow.
Yeah. It completely changes the harmonic foundation of the ensemble.
Right. When your inner voices can reach down to a subterranean F, the entire chord structure of the music shifts downwards.
But why did they need this? I mean, looking at this massive catalog of 7 instruments, I have to ask, why was this family so incredibly extensive?
It's a great question. Why did they need a screaming, high Klein-Pascha-Geigen, a standard violin, a small viola on C, and a massive chest-rattling viola starting on F?
It seems terribly inefficient from an instrument maker's perspective.
It does seem inefficient to us, but that's because we think in terms of the modern string quartet.
Right, our brains are stuck in that specific box.
If we look at the underlying mechanisms driving this, the violin family at this time was still heavily influenced by the older Renaissance concept of the chest of viols.
Let's clarify that for listeners who might not be deep into Renaissance history. A chest of viols wasn't just a random assortment of instruments.
No, it was literally a matched, custom-built set of instruments of varying sizes.
Right. A luthier would build them all from the same specific cuts of wood, using the same varnish, so they would blend perfectly together.
Almost mimicking the seamless blend of a human vocal, choir, soprano, alto, tenor, bass.
Exactly. The mindset of a 17th century German composer wasn't, I have a high voice, a middle voice, and a low voice.
Right.
It was a desire for a vast, unbroken gradient of tonal colors. They wanted a seamless transition from the highest piercing note down to the lowest rumble.
And crucially, because instrument making wasn't standardized across a unified country, the actual physical contents of these chests or instrument families varied dramatically depending on where you were standing.
Yeah, a wealthy dupe in Dresden might commission a completely different set of string sizes and tunings than a rival court down in Munich.
Okay, wait. Biomechanically, my brain is snagging on the physics of this Bassa da Braccio.
I don't blame you.
Praetorius explicitly calls it a da Braccio instrument, meaning an instrument of the arm. But if it's tuned to a low F, a full perfect fifth lower than a normal viola C string, how massive did this wooden box have to be?
It's a massive physical problem.
Think about the acoustic volume required to produce a resonant, projecting low F. You can't just put a loose floppy string on a standard 16-inch viola and expect it to project in a chapel.
Absolutely not. The body of the instrument had to be gigantic to move that much air.
So could a normal human being actually hold this thing on their arm? How on earth is there no historical record of mass shoulder injuries?
Well, that is the multi-million-dollar question that baffled music historians for decades.
Really?
Yeah, it brings us perfectly to the brutal physical reality of wrestling these instruments. The short answer to your question is barely. They could barely hold them.
I can't even imagine.
The term Bassa da Braccio confused scholars precisely because these instruments, based on the physics of their pitch, seemed way too large and heavy to realistically be played on the arm in any way that we conceive of today.
But the terminology da Braccio implies they absolutely belong to the arm-held family, not the leg-held gamba family.
Correct. They weren't resting these on the floor with an end pin.
No end pins. No resting them between the knees. They were elevated.
Right. So we have to talk about the physical tool of this.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
If you were a teacher or a performer listening to this right now, you know the physical reality of playing a slightly oversized modern viola.
We complain constantly about a 16.5-inch or 17-inch viola being too heavy, causing neck strain, shoulder impingement, and back pain.
But Riley's research in this chapter reveals the staggering, almost unbelievable size of these 17th century large tenors.
We're talking about instruments with actual measured body lengths up to 51 centimeters.
51 centimeters. Let's convert that for our listeners in the U.S. That is 20 inches.
A 20-inch body length.
That's insane. A standard full-size violin is about 14 inches. A standard, large, modern viola, the kind that makes violists groan when they have to play a 4-hour opera, is maybe 16.5 inches.
Right. Or if you have incredibly long arms, maybe you play a 17-inch.
But a 20-inch instrument is essentially a fractional-sized cello. And they were holding this on their upper body.
It sounds physically impossible. And honestly, when historians first started uncovering these dimensions, many assumed that Praetorius must have made a typo in his treatise.
Really? They thought it was just a mistake.
Yeah, or that the terminology was just incredibly loose and sloppy. The prevailing theory for a long time was that these 20-inch instruments must have been played gamba style, between the knees, resting on the calves, because it's the only thing that makes biomechanical sense.
But they were wrong.
They were totally wrong.
Because the historical evidence definitively proves they weren't played between the knees.
Right. And the most compelling proof doesn't come from a dusty manuscript or a forgotten diary entry.
No, it comes from forensic art history.
Exactly. Iconography, the visual evidence from paintings, frescoes, and woodcut prints of the era, provides definitive proof that these massive 51-centimeter instruments were hoisted up and held entirely off the ground.
This is where cross-disciplinary research becomes so vital. You can't just read the music. You have to look at the visual culture.
And Riley cites some very specific, highly detailed historical paintings in Chapter 5 that we just have to unpack.
Yes. Let's get into the paintings. The first major piece of evidence is by the Munich painter Hans Mielich, who lived from 1516 to 1573.
Right. And sometime right between 1565 and 1570, Mielich painted a portrait of a musical gathering featuring Orlando de Lasso.
We should definitely pause to contextualize who Orlando de Lasso was, because he isn't just a random figure.
Oh, not at all. He was one of the absolute greatest, most influential composers from the Netherlands. He was the musical superstar of his day.
He really was. He served all over Europe. He worked in Sicily, Milan, Naples, Rome, Antwerp, before ultimately settling down in Munich,
where he became the prestigious Kapellmeister to Duke Albert V of Bavaria.
This man wrote more than 2,000 compositions. He was a titan.
So if he was running an ensemble, he was utilizing the absolute cutting-edge practices of his time.
Absolutely. So Hans Mielich paints this titan, Lasso, seated majestically at a harpsichord, actively conducting the Bavarian court orchestra.
And in this painting, which is widely considered to be a highly accurate, detailed snapshot of 16th century performance practice, almost like a photograph of the era, 3 specific performers of large tenors are clearly depicted.
Yes. If you zoom in and analyze the foreground and the background of Mielich painting, you see the physical reality of the era.
You see one violist seated slightly in front of the harpsichord. A second violist is standing behind a gamba player.
And both of these musicians are holding massive tenor violas. And they're holding them in a very specific, severely slanted downward position.
But it's the third violist in the painting that is truly shocking to a modern string player.
Yeah, the third violist is standing immediately to the right and slightly behind the harpsichord.
And he is shown holding his instrument entirely crosswise to his body, almost horizontally across his chest.
And this specific instrument is visibly substantially larger than the other 2 tenors depicted in the painting.
Exactly. Riley points to this figure and suggests this largest instrument perfectly visually corresponds to Praetorius's Bassa da Braccio, the beast, with that sternum-rattling low F tuning.
And we aren't just relying on one isolated painting from Munich either.
No, we have corroborating visual evidence stretching into later periods.
Right. There's a very famous print by the artist Bernard Picart, dating from 1701.
It shows a musician playing one of these huge, large tenors, an instrument we would definitely classify as a small cello today.
But instead of holding it under the chin, which would literally snap his collarbone,
The bottom of the instrument is resting firmly on a wooden stool while the player bows it horizontally across his body.
it's just wild to visualize. And then there's the beautiful painting simply titled The Concert by the Florentine artist Antonio Gabbani, who lived from 1652 to 1726.
Right. Even almost a full century after Mielich painted Orlando di Lasso, Gabbani paints two separate performers holding large tenor violas at that exact same severe downward angle.
So if we synthesize all of this visual data from Mielich, Picart, and Gabbani, we can essentially reverse engineer the exact biomechanics of 17th century viola playing.
They absolutely were not holding these 20-inch instruments tucked neatly under their chins parallel to the floor like a modern soloist playing the Bartók viola concerto.
Not a chance. The sheer weight of the solid wood, the heavy gut strings, and the leverage of a 51-centimeter instrument would destroy the player's neck and cause massive nerve damage in the left shoulder within minutes.
So how did they survive the gig? What was the physical mechanism that allowed them to play a 2-hour mass?
Well, they engineered a completely different posture. Violists aimed the heavy scroll sharply downward toward the floor.
And crucially, they literally rested their left elbows directly against their ribs or their chest.
They pinned their elbow to their body just to support the raw weight.
It was human structural bracing. You are essentially turning your rib cage into a shelf for the instrument.
Wait, you're telling me they rested a 20-inch box of vibrating wood directly on their chest? What happens to the breathing?
I mean, you are literally compressing the diaphragm of the musician while they're trying to play.
That's the brilliant and somewhat terrifying reality of historical performance practice.
Resting the elbow on the chest was the only viable physical workaround to avoid rapid, extreme muscular fatigue from supporting a 51-centimeter span of solid wood and low-tension gut strings.
You sacrifice breathing comfort and mobility for endurance.
Exactly. I want to make this tangible for the listeners. Imagine this for a second. If you are a performer, I want you to literally try this right now if you are in a place where you can safely move around.
Oh, this is a great exercise.
Pin your left elbow firmly, tightly against your ribs. Point your imaginary scroll down towards the floor at a 45-degree angle.
Okay, I'm doing it.
Now, while keeping your elbow pinned, try to imagine shifting your left hand up the fingerboard to 5th or 6th position.
You literally can't do it. Your hand is trapped.
Right. The geometry of your forearm won't allow your hand to travel up the neck.
And that physical anatomical limitation directly dictated the compositional style of the entire era.
It had to. Because of this incredibly cumbersome braced posture, the musical demands for the tenor player in the 16th and 17th centuries rarely, if ever, took them out of first position.
And they almost never went beyond third position.
The instrument was simply too massive and the posture too restrictive to allow for any kind of upper register, high-flying agility.
This is one of my absolute favorite concepts in music history. It is such a brilliant, stark example of how intrinsically linked physical instrument design is to the complexity of the repertoire written for it.
You cannot separate the music on the page from the physical reality of the wood, the gut, and the limitations of the human body.
Composers back then weren't stupid.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what their players were capable of.
Right. They couldn't write high, soaring, fast, virtuosic lines for the large tenor because the player physically couldn't reach the notes while holding a 20-inch wooden box braced against their chest.
It completely reframes how we view early music. It forces us to realize that the perceived limitations or simplicity of early viola parts weren't because the players were less skilled.
Or because the viola was viewed as a lesser instrument.
Exactly. It was because they were quite literally wrestling a physical beast. It was a conscious, calculated trade-off.
They willingly sacrificed left-hand agility in exchange for this incredibly deep, booming, resonant acoustic chamber that could project that low F string to the back of a stone cathedral.
Okay, so we know they were physically bracing these massive instruments against their ribs. We know the trade-offs they were making. But that creates a massive pedagogical problem.
Oh, a huge one.
How do you actually teach a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old student to do that without destroying their posture entirely? Did teachers back then even care about ergonomics?
And how did you instruct someone to navigate this beast?
Right. This is where we transition from the physical hardware to the software, the pedagogy.
We have to look at the written instruction manuals of the 17th century German writers who actively worked to codify string playing.
Aside from Praetorius, There was a whole roster of brilliant theorists who contributed to this effort.
You have figures like Daniel Hisler, who lived from 1575 to 1635. You have Athanasius Kircher from 1602 to 1680.
And Johann Andreas Herbst, Georg Falk, and a man named Daniel Merck.
Now, Riley makes a very astute observation in this chapter. He notes that a lot of these guys actually didn't sit down to write massive, dedicated treatises specifically about the viola.
Yeah, a lot of these manuals were actually singing treatises or general music theory books that just happened to have an appendix tacked onto the back about string instruments.
But the details they do casually include in those appendices are absolute gold mines for understanding how they conceptualize the viola.
So true. We have to start by zooming in on Daniel Merck because his specific work is a massive milestone.
Yes. In 1695, right at the tail end of the century, he published a book called the Compendium Musicae Instrumentalis Cellicae.
This text is widely considered by scholars to be the first known German tutor published specifically, exclusively for the violin family.
I have to say, I absolutely love Merck's attitude. He is so fiercely pragmatic.
Very no-nonsense.
He explicitly states in the introduction of the book that this method is not for advanced artists or seasoned professionals. It is strictly for beginners and intermediate students.
He basically says point blank, look, I am not going to teach you advanced spiccato. I'm not going to teach you arpeggiato.
He knew that those fancy, complex, bouncing bow techniques were reserved for the absolute top-tier virtuosos of the day.
Guys like Heinrich Bieber, Johann Jakob Walther, and Johann Paul von Westhoff.
Merck was writing for the working musician.
Merck was highly practical.
Yeah.
And he was deeply concerned with the economic realities of the music profession.
He had very strong, very vocal opinions on pedagogy.
Oh, he certainly did.
Yeah.
In his writings, he famously warned his readers against the temptation of hiring cheap, unqualified teachers just to save a few coins.
He wrote that it is far better to pay for a good teacher than to employ a bungler.
And the specific, highly derogatory German word he used for those cheap teachers was Stumpler.
I guarantee you, any viola studio teacher listening to this right now is cheering in their car or their practice room.
Absolutely. Daniel Merck, all the way back in 1695, aggressively advocating for paying private teachers a living wage so you don't end up ruining your child's technique with a Stumpler.
It just proves that some things never, ever change in music education.
It's a universal truth. Quality instruction costs money. But returning to the mechanics of the instrument itself, Merck's 1695 tutor is completely invaluable to us.
Because it vividly illustrates the chaotic, maddening multiplicity of names for the viola floating around Germany at the end of the 17th century.
We think of it simply as the viola today. It's one word.
But back then, if you were a gigging musician hired to play the inner voices in a chord ensemble, you had to navigate a terrifying labyrinth of terminology just to know what chair to sit in.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare for a contractor.
Merck lists the usual tuning, C, G, D, A, but he points out that this exact same tuning is used for an instrument that goes by a ridiculous number of names depending on who is talking.
Right. He lists violetta. He lists viola vil secunda. He lists soprano viola. He calls it the cantus.
And, just to add some international flair, he even lists a French term that had bled into German usage. Französisch Alta Contre.
That is 5 entirely different names for what is essentially the exact same acoustic tuning.
And the complexity didn't stop at the name of the instrument. It extended directly to the sheet music put in front of the player.
Depending on which of those 5 names the composer decided to write at the top of the page, you, as the performer, had to read a completely different clef.
Merck meticulously explains the rules for this. He writes that music for the Hohe Alt and the Französisch T is standardly written in the mezzo-soprano clef.
The mezzo-soprano clef. Let's unpack that for our modern players who are used to the standard alto clef.
The mezzo-soprano clef is a C clef placed entirely on the second line from the bottom of the 5-line staff.
Right, which shifts every single note on the page down a third visually.
It's a sight-reading nightmare if you aren't prepared for it.
Absolutely. But then Merck continues, clarifying that the ordinary alt, which was their term for the regular standard viola, and the parts labeled violas 1, 2, and 3, which he also oddly refers to as the Französisch Quinte.
All of those specific parts use the standard alto clef on the middle line.
And just to keep everyone thoroughly confused and on their toes, Merck concludes this section by stating that if a composer labels a part the tenor, which is also confusingly called the viola,
that specific part plays music written on the tenor clef, where the C is located on the 4th line up from the bottom.
If we take Merck's frantic cataloging of clefs and synthesize it with the writings of the other theorists of the era, we get a very clear, mathematically provable picture of just how massive these tenor instruments truly were.
For instance, let's look at Athanasius Kircher. He wrote a significant piece called Symphonia pro Celebes, which roughly translates to Symphony of Violins.
And it's uniquely scored for 2 violins, an alto viola, and a mysterious fourth part labeled bass viola.
And Kircher writes this entire bass viola part explicitly in the tenor clef.
Which is the absolute smoking gun for historians.
Yes. In the supplementary text, Kircher refers to this specific part as a basso violone.
Now, if we apply basic logic, if he had intended that part to be played by a standard cello or a double bass, he would have undoubtedly scored it in the bass clef.
Because the bass clef was the absolute, unquestioned standard for the cello family at the time.
The fact that he specifically chose to write it in the tenor clef proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it was meant for that massive 20-inch large tenor viola.
The Bassa da Braccio that Praetorius talked about.
I love this. It's like forensic musicology. You don't have the physical instrument anymore, so you look at the clef on the page to deduce the physical size of the wooden box that must have been in the room.
It's amazing. And speaking of the physical technique required to play these instruments, we absolutely have to talk about Georg Falk.
Yes, Georg Falk. He published an incredibly influential manual in 1688 titled Idea Boni Cantoris.
He provides detailed instructions for the amateur string player, but he specifically recommends a physical technique that would make a modern string teacher instantly faint.
Oh, you mean the French bow grip?
Exactly. He highly recommends the French bow grip.
This is a massive departure from modern technique. For those listeners who might not be deeply versed in historical bowing, the 17th century French bow grip involved the player holding their thumb entirely under the hair of the bow,
rather than resting the thumb on the wooden stick.
You literally press the flesh of your thumb directly against the horsehair while you were playing. Let's think about the physics of that for a second.
It fundamentally changes the entire physics and leverage of the bow stroke.
By pressing the hair with your thumb, you can manually tighten or loosen the tension of the hair on the fly.
It gives you a massive immediate bite on the string. This makes it highly suited for producing very crisp, rhythmic, highly articulated strokes.
Which was perfect for the complex dance music of the era.
But the massive trade-off is that it completely sabotages your ability to pull a smooth, seamless, powerful legato.
The modern Franco-Belgian bow grip we use today is designed to sink weight into the string for long, sustained lines. The French grip is designed for articulation.
And Falk also mentions the occasional daring use of the sixth position in his manual.
Which is terrifying when you consider the hardware.
Exactly. On a modern violin or viola, shifting to sixth position is high, but it's standard repertoire.
But on those 17th century instruments, going to sixth position meant you were physically pushing your hand to the absolute very end of the incredibly short fingerboards they used at the time.
You were literally running out of real estate on the wood.
So I want to take a breath and try to synthesize this entire physical reality in our minds. Let's put all the pieces together.
Okay, let's do it.
You have violists physically wrestling 20-inch, massive instruments, bracing them against their ribs, crushing their diaphragms just to hold them up.
You have players memorizing 5 different names for the exact same instrument.
You have performers physically pressing their thumbs under the raw horsehair of the bow.
And they are aggressively sight-reading across mezzo-soprano, alto, and tenor clefs on the fly, depending on what country the composer was trying to emulate that week.
So what did the actual music sound like under these wild, incredibly demanding conditions?
That is the perfect question to ask, because all of this intense theoretical groundwork, all of these wild physical biomechanics, they set the stage for an absolute explosion in compositional output.
These conditions didn't hinder the music. They created a highly unique, deeply resonant acoustic environment that composers eagerly, aggressively exploited.
Which brings us to the musical revolution itself. The transition of the viola from mere harmonic accompaniment to the absolute spotlight.
Historically, before this period, the viola often got stuck playing the harmonic filler. Right?
It played the boring inner voices, the whole notes, the simple rhythms.
But in 17th century Germany, the viola violently broke out of that restrictive box. And ironically, the spark that lit this massive native German string movement actually came from across the Alps.
It came from Italy.
The German courts we mentioned earlier, they were incredibly wealthy, and they wanted the absolute best talent money could buy.
So the prestigious court of Saxony in Dresden imported an Italian violin virtuoso named Carlo Farina.
He was originally from Mantua, and he worked in Dresden from around 1625 to 1632.
Farina didn't just bring a new accent, he brought the Italian monodic style.
He brought virtuoso pyrotechnics, double stops, and highly programmatic compositions that completely blew the minds of the native German musicians.
Because they were used to much more conservative, polyphonic Renaissance writing.
We should clarify what the Italian monodic style is for our listeners. Essentially, it was the invention of a single, expressive solo line backed by chords, usually played by a continuo section.
It was a massive departure from the thick, equally interwoven, equal voice polyphony of the Renaissance. It allowed for a star soloist to emerge.
Precisely. And Farina's most famous, most influential composition from this time in Dresden was printed in 1628.
It's called the Capriccio Stravagante.
And what's fascinating for our deep dive into the viola is not just the flashy violin writing, but the highly specific scoring of the ensemble.
He didn't just write for a solo violin and a generic bass line. He meticulously scored it for canto, the high violin, alto, which was a small viola, tenor, the massive large viola we've been discussing, and basso, the cello.
He explicitly, deliberately separated the inner voices into two distinctly different sizes of viola to exploit their different acoustic resonances.
He wanted the specific punch of the small viola and the deep, rumbling resonance of the large 20-inch tenor simultaneously.
And this Italian influence rapidly cross-pollinated with native German genius. The German composers took this Italian flash and grounded it with their native love for dark, rich harmonies.
Look at Johann Hermann Schein, who lived from 1586 to 1630. He was an absolute pioneer in bringing the new Italian styles to Germany.
He was actually the cantor at the Thomas Schule in Leipzig, an entire century before Johann Sebastian Bach made that exact same position legendary.
Schein was a master of synthesis. He wrote a stunning, deeply textured suite in G major, composed in 5 specific dance movements: a Paduana, a Gagliarda, a Carente, an Allemande, and a Tripla.
Now, Riley points out a really fascinating, highly illustrative historical mistake regarding this specific piece.
Right. A 20th century musicologist named Hermann Beck included this suite in a massive historical anthology, but Beck totally, fundamentally misidentified the instruments Schein actually intended to play the piece.
This shows how easy it is to misinterpret history if you don't understand the clefs.
Beck looked at the original score, which was labeled cantus, quinta, alto, and tenore.
Because the first 3 parts, the cantus, quint, and alto, were all written in the treble clef, Beck logically assumed they must be 3 violins, and that only the tenore, which was written in the alto clef, was the lone viola.
It's a completely logical assumption for a 20th century scholar to make. But Riley corrects the historical record using the deep contextual knowledge we just discussed.
You have to remember who Schein was. He was a cantor, a choir director deeply rooted in vocal traditions.
In choral music, cantus simply means the highest, most important melodic voice. It doesn't automatically mean violin.
And in both Italian and French string music of the time, the terms quinta and alto were exclusively used to designate the viola, regardless of what clef was used for convenience.
Furthermore, if you look at the actual notes on the page, only the lowest part, the tenore, physically goes low enough in pitch to actually mandate the use of the alto clef to avoid drawing a dozen ledger lines.
So despite the visual confusion of the treble clefs, Schein most likely, almost certainly intended this massive suite to be played by either 1 violin and 3 violas, or at the very least 2 violins and 2 violas.
He wasn't writing for a top-heavy ensemble of screaming violins. He was deliberately building a massive, thick, incredibly rich inner texture using multiple distinct viola voices.
And as the century progressed, the native German compositional talent began to not just emulate, but actively rival the Italians.
This is where we arrive at the Viennese master Johann Heinrich Schmelzer, who lived from around 1623 to 1680.
He was instrumental in establishing a specific, highly influential school of violin playing in Vienna that achieved massive international renown.
And the defining characteristic of Schmelzer's school, he absolutely loved the viola.
He didn't just love it. He fundamentally elevated the viola beyond mere rhythmic accompaniment.
He wrote a piece called Sonata Violino Solo cum Braccio. The scoring for this is almost unbelievable by modern symphonic standards.
It is scored for 1 violin solo, a continuous section, and 4 entirely independent, fully fleshed out viola parts.
4 independent violas. Imagine the physical resonance in a highly reverberant stone chapel with 4 violists aggressively playing those deep, thick, gut-springed instruments, some of them likely the massive 20-inch large tenors.
The air in the room would literally vibrate. It would sound like a choir of Russian baritones.
It creates a bed of sound that is incredibly dark, velvety, and powerful.
Schmelzer also published a highly influential compilation in 1662 called the Sacroprofanus Concertus Musicus, which heavily featured significant, highly independent, complex sonatas scored specifically for violin, viola, and trombone.
Talk about a brassy, incredibly dark, menacing timbre.
You have the piercing violin on top, the gut string resonance of the viola in the middle, and the metallic blast of trombone on the bottom.
Schmelzer's influence was massive across Europe, but his most enduring legacy was likely the fact that he was the teacher of Heinrich J.F. von Bieber.
Bieber, who lived from 1644 to 1704, is a legend. He founded the legendary German school of violin playing in Salzburg.
For context, this is the very same pedagogical school, the exact same cultural lineage that would later produce Leopold Mozart, who of course was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's father.
The DNA of Salzburg string playing starts right here. And Bieber took his teacher Schmelzer's deep love for the viola and just completely ran with it.
In 1676, Bieber wrote the sonatas Tam ars quam alles. Again, the scoring is wild by today's standards. 2 violins and 4 distinct violas.
Now, there's been some highly contentious modern academic debate about this specific piece.
The respected writer and musicologist Sheila M. Nelson pointed out that the lowest of Bieber's 4 viola parts is actually written in the bass clef, and crucially, the notes go below the regular viola's low C range.
Because of this, she strongly theorized it must have been played on a cello.
It seems like a slam-dunk theory on the surface, but Riley strongly, aggressively counters Nelson's theory in this chapter.
He points out that the part in the original manuscript is explicitly, clearly marked by Bieber for the viola.
So why would a composer write a part for the viola that physically drops below the instrument's lowest C string?
This brings us full circle, all the way back to the beginning of our deep dive. It brings us right back to Michael Praetorius' Table 22.
It is highly, highly likely that Bieber fully intended that lowest subterranean part to be played on the Bassa da Braccio, the massive 20-inch large tenor explicitly tuned to low F, C, G, G.
Or, alternatively, the exact same F tuning on the tenor Geigen mentioned by Daniel Hisler in his treatises.
It's incredible how all of this connects. The massive 20-inch instruments we talked about earlier weren't just weird theoretical anomalies collecting dust in a corner.
Composers like Bieber were actively, hungrily utilizing that specific subterranean F string to create a totally unique acoustic foundation.
It wasn't quite a cello. It didn't have the massive air volume of a cello, but it was significantly deeper and more resonant than a standard viola.
It occupied a highly specific sonic frequency that is now entirely lost to us.
And we have to remember that it wasn't just the hyper-elite professional court virtuosos playing the viola during this era.
Towards the end of the 17th century, we see undeniable documentary proof that playing the viola was immensely popular among everyday, middle-class amateur players.
In 1697, the composer Daniel Speer published 2 highly accessible trio sonatas, specifically scored for 2 violas and continuo, a sonata in F major and a sonata in A major.
These sonatas are utterly fascinating to analyze because they are, essentially, the 17th century equivalent of educational Suzuki music.
They consist of short, digestible movements, and the first viola part stays entirely safely planted in the first position.
No terrifying shifts to the end of the fingerboard required.
But Speer doesn't let the second viola player off easily at all.
The viola of the second player is actively required to read fluently in both the alto and the tenor clefs, constantly alternating back and forth between them to avoid excessive ledger lines when the part dips into the lower registers.
It requires a lot of mental agility.
What's really telling is that Speer explicitly states in his published introduction that these sonatas were absolutely not intended for professional court violists, nor were they for absolute day-one beginners.
He states they were explicitly written for amateur violists who had mastered basic bowing, fingering, and rhythmic counting.
They were for the weekend warriors.
Which proves a really profound point about the culture of the era. Playing the viola was a widespread, highly popular pastime in 17th century Germany.
It wasn't just a niche, highly specialized profession for a handful of court musicians in Dresden or Munich.
Regular citizens were buying these instruments, taking lessons, hopefully not from Stumpler teachers, and playing these sonatas in their living rooms.
Speer also casually mentioned in his introduction that these pieces could be played by viola da gambas if violas weren't available.
Which perfectly illustrates just how fluid and relaxed the boundaries between the arm-held and leg-held instrument families still were at this time.
I love how this entire era proves that the viola was actively transitioning. It was violently stepping out of the shadows as a purely harmonic filler instrument and demanding to be recognized as an instrument capable of dedicated, incredibly multi-part harmonic complexity.
There's a wonderful, deeply charming quote from an anonymous 17th century manuscript called the Woja Sonata.
Oh, I love this quote.
The performance advice scrawled directly onto the score says, "Zweit Violinen müssen eine Bratzen gespielt werden, des Liedlich dat Willen."
Which translates so beautifully to, if the second violinist plays a viola, it will be delightful.
It will be delightful. I love that.
They knew it. They inherently understood that substituting a bright, piercing second violin with the darker, richer, more complex tone of a viola brought a specific joy, a specific acoustic warmth to the entire ensemble that you just couldn't replicate with any other instrument.
It really perfectly summarizes the fundamental German aesthetic of the time. They were utterly captivated by the depth, the thick resonance, and the highly unique timbre of the viola family in all its various, sometimes chaotic sizes and tunings.
And that brings us organically to the end of our journey today. What an incredible, mind-expanding deep dive.
We started with Michael Praetorius methodically, obsessively cataloging a vast, somewhat chaotic family of Geigen in 1618, including that massive, terrifying bass Geig with the chest-rattling low F string.
We explored the brutal physical reality of wrestling those 20-inch, 51-centimeter instruments, physically pinning them against your ribs just to support the raw weight of the wood, and how that highly restrictive posture directly forced the music to stay largely in the first few positions.
We navigated the strict, highly opinionated warnings of Daniel Merck against hiring bungler teachers. Seriously, pay your teachers what they're worth, folks.
And we looked at the absolute headache of sight reading across 3 different C clefs, just depending on what the composer decided to name your instrument that day.
And finally, we saw how all of that physical and theoretical foundation gave birth to the lush, dense, incredibly rich multi-viola compositions of Schein, Schmelzer, Bieber, and Speer.
By the end of the 17th century, Germany had arguably given the viola more prestige, more dedicated, highly complex repertoire, and more acoustic exploration than any other country in Europe, period.
And that precise, highly experimental environment laid the exact foundation for the earliest important virtuosic solo music that would eventually emerge in the 18th century in cities like Hamburg and Berlin.
It's a profoundly foundational era, but examining it also leaves us with a somewhat melancholic historical reality to grapple with.
As we transition our minds back to the present day, to our highly standardized modern string sections, it raises a very important acoustic question.
Over the next centuries, instrument makers eventually ruthlessly standardized the viola. They shrank it down to a manageable 16 or 17 inches so it could be played comfortably under the chin, completely mirroring the virtuosic high-mobility posture of the violin.
We gained the physical ability to shift effortlessly into the upper stratosphere of the fingerboard, to play blazing fast, off-the-string spiccato passages.
We gained agility, but at what acoustic cost?
Exactly. Did we inadvertently lose a distinct, highly resonant, deep, true tenor voice in the process of standardizing for comfort and agility?
I think we absolutely did. And I want to leave you, the listener, the teacher, the performer, with a physical experiment to try.
Next time you're warming up in the practice room, take a moment and actually detune your C string down a full perfect fifth to an F. Just try it.
It sounds incredibly flabby and loose on a modern 16-inch viola. It won't project at all.
But as you feel that complete lack of tension under your bow, try to imagine a wooden body large enough, a physical chamber massive enough to make that specific string roar.
Imagine a 20-inch wooden box vibrating against your ribs. What kind of music would that intense physical vibration force you to write?
It completely changes your relationship to the music. When you play a work by Bieber or Schmelzer on your modern standardized viola today, you have to realize you are playing a transcription of an extinct acoustic experience.
When those composers heard this music in their heads, they were hearing an instrument that physically moved the air in the room in a way we can no longer replicate.
That is a haunting and incredibly beautiful thought to take into your next rehearsal.
The next time you are tasked with playing those inner voices, don't just blend in. Try to channel a little bit of that 17th century German acoustic power.
Keep diving deep into your music. Keep exploring the hidden history beneath the ink on the page.
Thank you so much for sharing this incredible source material with us, and as always, thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. A Viola Studio production.